The snow was older than the year. It fell without grace, clumped in wet, heavy drifts that sucked at boot soles and swallowed sound. Above the sky sagged gray and without break, and the wind came low across the plains, dragging a fine mist of ice and earth with it. She stood on the edge of the town skirts, frozen stiff where they touched her knees, the baby pressed silent and blue-faced against her chest, two others clinging to either side. No house opened to her. Not one. Wood smoke curled from chimneys. Behind window panes, lamps glowed steady and golden. A dog barked once and was hushed. She knocked again, knuckles raw and bleeding, but this door too stayed closed. A child peeked from behind a curtain, then vanished. Her name had not meant much in this town, not even when her husband was alive. Now that he was dead, thrown from his horse neck, snapped like a matchstick out near the cattle road, her name meant even less. Just a burden to be buried, not helped. A woman alone in the West was a thing like a ghost seen, pitied but never touched. Her son, 6, maybe 7, tugged at her sleeve. "Mama," he said. She looked down, eyes rimmed red, and said nothing. The girl beside him didn't speak at all. Her lips were cracked from wind and cold, her eyes lost somewhere else. She held her doll like a bone. The baby gave a soft cough, more breath than voice, and tucked its face closer to her chest. She could not carry them all another mile. Not through this cold. Her knees ached from old frostbite, her boots were thin as paper. She had no more food. The coins she'd wrapped in a kerchief and pinned inside her bodice had long since been spent for milk, for bread, for one bitter room. They'd been chased from 3 nights ago. She turned from the door, didn't knock again. Behind her the town crouched in its warmth and indifference. Ahead the prairie stretched wide and white. A ribbon of road, nearly invisible now beneath the drifts, wound out toward the low hills, where the trees grew crooked and the wind never stopped moving. She walked. The boy limped. The girl shivered and kept her head down. Somewhere behind a chimney popped and a train whistle sounded lonely and long. No one followed them. No one asked. When she stumbled, she bit the inside of her cheek to keep from crying out. Her hands were no good now. The cold had turned her fingers stiff and purple. Still she held the baby. Still she walked. A mile passed. Maybe 2. She lost count. She did not see the rider at first. The snow had grown thick again, swirling sideways, and her lashes were clumped with frost. But then a shape moved where nothing else had moved all day, and she stopped, heart sinking. A man. A horse. Tall and quiet, watching from just beyond the rise. Her first instinct was to turn away. Another man meant another closed door. Another, maybe. Another, no. But the horse stepped forward, slow and careful, steam rising from its nostrils. The man wore a long coat, dark with wet at the hem. His hat was pulled low. He said nothing as he approached, but he stopped just 10 feet away, eyes on her, then on the children. She straightened. The wind pushed between them like a wall. The boy moved behind her. The girl clutched her hand. Still the man did not speak. He looked at her with something close to thoughtfulness, or maybe just fatigue. Then he reached down slowly and dismounted. She watched him, spine, taut legs half collapsing. He came forward, led the horse by the reins. The animal snorted and shook its head, but followed. When he stood close enough to see her face, he frowned. Not in anger. In concern. "Ma'am," he said. She swallowed. "Please," she whispered, though she had not meant to speak. He looked again at the children. At the baby. At her hands. "I've got a barn," he said quietly. "It's dry. Got a stove. Some hay." She said nothing. She could not. "I ain't asking your name," he added. "You don't need to trust me. But if you stay out here," he looked up at the sky, "well, you already know." The baby coughed again. The boy's lips were blue. "I won't touch you," the man said. "You can have the barn to yourself. I got extra blankets. That's all." Still, she didn't move. But when the boy pulled her skirt and the girl looked up for the first time in hours, she nodded. Once. The man said nothing more. He helped her onto the horse, then lifted the children up with slow, careful hands. They rode into the wind together, silent. The barn stood apart from the house, half sunk into a shallow dip in the land, its roof sagging under a blanket of snow. Smoke drifted from the chimney of the small cabin nearby, but the man didn't glance toward it. He opened the barn door and led the horse inside, its hooves muffled on the straw. The air inside smelled of old hay-horse sweat and dust, warmer than outside, though still sharp enough to bite the lungs. The girl sneezed, sudden and small. The boy helped his sister down before slipping off the saddle himself. She dismounted last, her knees trembling so bad she nearly fell, but the man caught her arm. Just for a second. Then he let go. He moved to the back of the barn, rummaging through a crate. She stood in place, not sure if she should speak or run or collapse. The baby stirred in her arms, making a sound that was barely a whimper. "I'll set the stove," the man said. "You got anything to eat?" She shook her head. He said nothing to that. Just pulled a battered tin box from the shadows and set it near the small iron stove in the corner. When he lit it, the flames crackled, filling the barn with sudden flickering gold. Shadows danced along the walls. Her children huddled near it, fingers outstretched. She stayed by the door, still holding the baby. "You can put him down," the man said. "Ain't much, but the hay's clean. Warmer than your arms, I'd wager." She stared at him, wary. He took a step back. "I'll turn around if you want." He did, without waiting for her answer. She laid the baby in the straw, wrapped him tighter in the old wool coat that had once belonged to her husband. Her arms ached with the relief of it. Her legs gave, and she sat beside the child, bones clicking from cold. "You hurt?" the man asked over his shoulder. "No." A pause. "Yes, yes." He didn't push. Just said, "I'll fetch some bread. Got some beans, too. Might be cold by now, but it's food." She nodded, though he couldn't see it. He walked out into the snow, closing the door behind him. The boy came to her, pressing close. The girl didn't speak, but knelt beside the baby and covered him with a bit of loose hay. Her doll lay forgotten. The woman touched the boy's hair. It was damp with sweat. He didn't look at her. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. The barn creaked once, but held firm. The fire popped and sighed. She closed her eyes and leaned her head against the boards behind her. When the man returned, he carried a dented pot and a wrapped bundle. He handed them through the dim without stepping too close. She opened the bundle, coarse bread thick with grain, and tore off pieces for the children. The pot smelled of salt and meat and something sharp like onion. It was warm enough to steam. She looked at him. "Why?" He took off his hat, wiped the snow from the brim. "Because someone should," he said. "Ain't right. What they did to you." She looked back down at the food. He sat on an upturned bucket near the stove, quiet. Let her eat. Let the silence sit between them. "Your man dead?" he asked, not looking at her. She hesitated. "Last spring. Cattle accident." She nodded. "Bad way to go." He took a sip from a flask, then offered it. She took it. The whiskey scorched her throat, but melted something in her chest. They didn't speak more. The children ate, then curled together in the hay. The boy's head rested on his sister's shoulder. The baby breathed soft and slow. The woman stayed awake, watching them. The man stoked the fire, then turned to her. "You can stay here the night. And more if you need. I'll bring more food tomorrow." She didn't thank him. Didn't trust her voice to hold. He stood, put his hat back on. Pause. "I'm Matthew," he said. She blinked. "Clara." He nodded once. Then he left. The wind howled again, but the barn held. Subscribe and walk where choices are hard and costly. In the morning the frost inside the barn had melted. Not entirely, her boots still crunched when she moved, but the air no longer stung her lungs. Light filtered in through the slats, pale and slow, turning the hay to dull gold. She sat up stiffly, every bone in her body aching like it belonged to someone else. The baby still slept, curled like a seed in the coat. The older two were pressed close to each other, the girl's arm draped over her brother's chest. Clara watched them a long time, listening to the slow, even breaths until the weight in her chest settled. Then she stood and stepped outside. The world was silent save for the wind threading through the bare cottonwoods. The house stood 100 yards off, squat and weathered, chimney smoke rising straight into the morning sky. There was a fence that had mostly fallen down, and a small lean-to filled with chopped wood. Beyond that, pasture land and open prairie touched by snow and light. Clara took one step forward before she saw him. Matthew was splitting wood, his coat thrown over the fence post, sleeves rolled past his elbows. His shirt was patched at the elbows and sweat darkened the back, though the air still carried a bite. He worked slow and steady, like the work mattered, not rushed, not careless. Every piece of wood he split he stacked with care. She stood watching him, uncertain, until he looked up. He didn't seem surprised, just nodded once. "Kids still sleeping?" She nodded back. He jabbed his chin toward the house. "Got coffee on the stove. You're welcome to it." She hesitated. "I won't follow you in," he added. "Just figured maybe you'd want to warm up." Her hands curled and uncurled at her sides. She looked back at the barn, then at the line of trees on the horizon. "Just coffee," he said again. "That's all." She went, slowly. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something faintly sweet. The stove hissed softly in the corner, and a small table sat in the center of the single room beside a well-worn rocker and a narrow bed tucked against the far wall. There was no clutter, no woman's hand in the place, no sign of children, just neat stacks of books along the windowsill and a small sketch pinned above the bed, an old pencil drawing of 2 horses, one resting its head on the other's back. Clara poured herself a cup and held it between her hands, breathing in the heat. She did not sit. When she returned to the barn, he was gone again. A bowl of eggs sat near the stove with a few thick slices of bacon wrapped in a cloth. The children were waking, stretching under the hay like small animals, their faces slack with sleep. She cooked while they stirred. It wasn't much, but the smell alone brought warmth into the room. By the time Matthew returned, the children were eating, and Clara was cleaning the pot with a scrap of linen. "You cook good," he said, setting down a sack near the door. "Better than I do." She didn't answer. "I brought flour, salt, some beans too. Figured you'd want to cook your own if you're staying." Clara raised her eyes. "How long?" He shrugged. "As long as you need. Not much goes on out here." "You live alone?" He nodded. 3 years now." "Why?" He leaned against the post and folded his arms. "Had a brother. He went east. Parents passed. This land was theirs. I stayed." The girl tugged on Clara's sleeve. "Can we go outside?" Clara looked at Matthew. He gave a small nod. "Stay near," Clara said. The children ran into the snow, their boots crunching soft paths. Matthew watched them a moment. "They're tough." They had to be. He studied her, something unreadable in his expression. "You too, I reckon." She didn't respond. She wiped her hands on her skirt and turned back toward the fire. "I've got a second horse," he said after a while, "if you're wanting to get into town, or if you need to look for work." Clara didn't turn around. He shifted his weight. "Or you can stay here. Help out. This place needs more hands than mine." She looked up at that. Not because of the offer, but because of how he said it. "Not Pity, not charity, just fact. She nodded slowly. All right. He smiled once barely and went back to his woodpile. Snow thawed in the weeks that followed, first in thin, grimy patches where the sun reached longest, then faster, sliding in wet sheets from the barn roof, pooling at the edges of the pasture, loosening the dirt road until wagon wheels sank and stuck. The world didn't turn green yet, but the light changed. It felt like waiting for something, something old and slow to wake. Clara began to move with more certainty. She gathered eggs from the hens that scratched behind the barn. She hauled water from the well. She mended the boy's boots with thread so coarse it blistered her fingers, but he smiled when he wore them again. She cleared out the corner of the barn and made it theirs, a pile of hay layered with old quilts, a small crate for clothes, a tin bowl for washing. Every morning Matthew brought fresh kindling. Every evening he left without asking questions. He never crossed into their space, never made her feel cornered. That was a kind of gift. One morning as she poured hot water into the bowl to scrub the baby, she noticed the boy sitting near the door watching Matthew work the fence line. He'd done that more and more lately, silent but curious. "You want to help him?" she asked. He shrugged. "You can." He didn't move right away, just stared a little longer. Then he stood and walked out into the light. Matthew handed him a hammer. No instructions, just offered it slow and patient. The boy took it like it meant something. Later that day, when Clara brought out a plate of bread and lard, she found the two of them sitting in the dirt, the fence stretched taut behind them. The boy's hands were raw, but his face looked different, lit up from somewhere inside. She set the plate down. Matthew tipped his hat. "He's got a steady eye," he said. "Did good." The boy didn't look at her. He just ate. By late March, the girl had warmed too. She sang when she thought no one was listening, soft, tuneless things while rocking the baby on her hip. She watched Clara with more trust now, helped with chores without needing to be told. There were still hard days, storms that rattled the barn roof, nights when the baby cried until dawn. Once Clara woke, gasping from a dream. She couldn't remember, hands clenched in her skirts, heart hammering. But she wasn't on the roadside anymore. She wasn't knocking at locked doors. She was somewhere. One morning Matthew handed her a folded piece of cloth. She turned it over in her hands, not understanding. "A dress," he said. "Belonged to my ma. Found it in the loft. Thought it might fit." She stared at the bundle. It was faded blue with tiny white flowers stitched at the hem. Something delicate. Meant for Sundays, not mud and work. She didn't know what to say. "You don't have to wear it," he said, already turning away. "Just thought you should have something that wasn't torn to pieces." She looked down at her threadbare sleeves, then back at him. "Thank you," she said softly. He paused. "You're welcome." That night she sat beside the stove in the barn after the children had gone to sleep. The dress lay across her lap. She touched the fabric slow, like it might dissolve. The wind outside had gone quiet. She didn't know yet what to make of this man, this place, but something in her chest ached in a new way. Not from pain, from the memory of softness. By April, the snow had retreated almost entirely, leaving behind mud, the scent of wet earth, and the first hints of green stubbornly poking through. Clara moved among it with a sense of cautious ownership. She carried water-chopped wood, cooked meals, tended to the children, and still managed to find pockets of quiet for herself. The barn no longer smelled only of straw and horse sweat. Now it carried the warmth of their living, the faint sweetness of bread baking on the stove, and the occasional tang of laundry drying by the window. Matthew's presence was steady but unobtrusive. He rode out each day to check fences, tend cattle, and inspect distant pastures, always returning by dusk. Sometimes he spoke. Sometimes he didn't. He never offered more than what was needed, never demanded more than they could give. Clara noticed the way he handled the children, gentle, patient, quiet, but never intrusive. She noticed it but said nothing. One afternoon, while mending a torn shirt for her son, she heard him outside calling for her. His voice carried over the open ground, low and even. She stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron, and found him leaning against the fence post, a bundle of wild onions and ramps in his hands. "Found these near the creek," he said. "Figured you might make something of them." She took them, smelled the fresh earth clinging to their roots. "I can," she said softly. He nodded, then tilted his hat back slightly. "Kid's been asking about the creek. You want to take them down, show them where the water's clean." She hesitated. Water had been a source of both sustenance and fear in these past months, muddy, freezing, unforgiving, but she nodded. "Yes, yes." The children squealed when they saw her. They ran ahead, boots, leaving deep prints in the softened dirt. The baby, bundled in a small coat, stayed close to her hip, looking up with wide, curious eyes. Matthew walked beside them, hands in pockets, eyes scanning the edges of the field. Clara noticed how his presence was solid without suffocating like the ground beneath her boots. The sun caught the slight curve of his jaw, the lines around his eyes. There was a softness there, but also something unyielding rooted. They reached the creek, and the children splashed water-soaking boots and skirts. Clara knelt on the bank, letting the baby lean forward to feel the water. The boy scooped a handful, letting it slip through his fingers, fascinated by its freedom. The girl dropped stones, counting them aloud. Clara watched them, a quiet ache swelling in her chest, fear, joy, and relief tangled together. Matthew crouched beside her. "They'll remember this," he said. "Small things like this stick longer than any lesson you try to teach." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time saw not a stranger, not a savior, not just a man who had given them shelter, but someone who carried his own quiet weight, who had lived alone, who had found something worth keeping in this harsh, endless land. Her hands rested on the baby's back, and she realized that trust was not an instantaneous gift. It had grown slowly like grass through frost-hardened soil. And in that trust, something like hope had taken root. When they returned to the barn, the sun was lower, throwing long shadows across the yard. Clara carried the baby inside, letting the children run ahead. She looked back at Matthew as he unhitched the horses, his movements easy, confident, and attentive. For a fleeting moment their eyes met, and neither looked away. Inside, the warmth of the stove welcomed them. Clara set the table for supper, her movements methodical but steady. The children chattered about their day at the creek, their laughter filling the barn like music. Matthew sat at the edge of the table, not speaking much, but present, a quiet anchor in the room. As the evening settled, Clara found herself standing near the window, watching the last light fade across the plains. The wind had died down. The mud glistened like glass. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled lazily, searching. She realized then that she no longer measured the world by what she had lost, but by what she could hold, this small, stubborn life she had carved out, the children who trusted her, and a man who had chosen to walk beside them, not ahead, not behind, but with them. The barn creaked softly, the stove hissed, and for the first time in months, Clara allowed herself to imagine the possibility of a future that was not just survival, but life. Weeks turned into months. The prairie thawed fully, and the stubborn shoots of green became blades of grass that swayed under the late spring wind. The children learned the rhythms of the land. The boy rode with Matthew on errands, to check fences, learning to balance on a horse and recognize the faint signs of cattle tracks. The girl followed Clara to the creek and the garden patch, helping her plant onions, beans, and a few stubborn carrots, learning the patience of soil and the satisfaction of harvest. Clara herself had begun to feel the weight in her arms lessen, not the physical weight of the children, but the burden of constant fear. Each day she rose, worked, cooked, repaired, and slept under a roof she could call home. She had learned to read Matthew's silences, when he was planning, when he was wary, when he simply meant no harm. One morning she found him repairing a section of fence that had been torn down by a spring storm. The wood was soaked and warped, but he worked steadily, his hat low against the sun, sweat beading on his forehead. Clara carried the baby toward him. "You shouldn't have to," she said. He shook his head. "This place'll hold itself together if we all chip in. You included." She hesitated, then set the baby down in a blanket near the barn and joined him. The work was hard, muscles straining back stiff, but it was tangible. By the end of the day, the fence was standing straighter than before, and they both carried the quiet satisfaction of labor finished. It was during one of these long days that Clara began to notice the subtle things about Matthew. The way he hummed softly when he worked alone. The way he paused at the horizon during his rides, looking not at the land but something beyond it. A photograph tucked into the corner of the cabin revealed a young woman with eyes like his, long gone, perhaps a sister, perhaps a fiancée lost in some other place. The softness behind his reserved demeanor, the tenderness in his interactions with her children, the care with which he handled animals and tools alike, all of it suggested a man capable of love, buried deep under the grit of solitude. One afternoon a wagon rolled into town, dust clouding behind it. A man stepped out, calling loudly, "Matthew, Matthew Caldwell." Clara watched from the barn door as Matthew's posture stiffened. His jaw tightened. The man spoke, gesturing toward a claim dispute outside of town, but Matthew's reply was clipped, measured, and final. The stranger left muttering under his breath, and Matthew exhaled slowly, leaning on the fence. "You okay?" Clara asked. "I've dealt with worse," he said. Then after a pause, "This land, these people doesn't always play fair. But this is our place now." She nodded, understanding more in that moment than words could hold. By late May, Clara had grown accustomed to the rhythm of life on the prairie. Her children laughed again without fear, the baby rolled and cooed, and she found herself looking at Matthew, less with suspicion and more with quiet appreciation. The first time she noticed it, she was mending a torn shirt by the fire while he prepared supper. He glanced at her, their eyes met, and she felt something stir, a fragile, cautious pull. It was unspoken but undeniable. Evening came, and the light lingered late, draping the barn in amber. Clara stood at the doorway, listening to the children's laughter, feeling the warm weight of the baby in her arms, and sensing Matthew's presence behind her. She didn't turn immediately. Instead, she let the silence settle, a shared, unpressured space. "You've done well," he said softly. She looked at him, then really looked, and something passed between them, a recognition of endurance, of loss, and of possibility. She nodded, small and sure. The wind rustled through the leaves beyond the barn. The prairie stretched endlessly, forgiving and indifferent, yet somehow intimate now. And for the first time since the death of her husband, Clara allowed herself to imagine not just survival, but a future with warmth, laughter, and a steady hand to guide her through it. In that quiet late spring evening, two lives began to intertwine, cautiously, honestly, without rush, yet with a growing certainty that neither had expected and both needed. Summer came early. By June, the earth cracked in places where rain hadn't touched, and the sun rose hot and fast, blistering the backs of their necks before breakfast. The creek still ran shallow and cool, though, and the wind cut hard across the plains in the evenings, lifting the smell of dust and wild grass into the sky. Clara moved with confidence now. She handled the chickens without flinching, patched the barn roof with rough nails and scrap tin, and showed the boy how to thread a fishhook with worm guts while the girl squealed and clung to her side. There was a rhythm to their life, hard but honest, and inside it a kind of peace had started to take hold. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. One afternoon, as the sun dropped low and orange behind the hills, a wagon rolled in from the north. Clara saw it before Matthew did. She stood outside the barn with a basket of dry clothes when the shape came over the rise, 2 horses, 1 driver, and someone seated beside him in a bonnet too clean for road travel. Matthew came up behind her, saw her face, then followed her eyes. His posture changed just slightly. Not tense, but wary. The wagon creaked to a stop in front of the cabin. The woman who climbed down was maybe 30, dressed like townfolk, but with the eyes of someone who'd never had to beg. She looked at Matthew like she knew him and didn't approve. "Matthew Caldwell," she said, brushing dust from her skirt. "Still playing farmer, I see." Clara stepped back instinctively. Matthew tipped his hat. "Abigail." The driver, a younger man with soft hands, unloaded a trunk. "You didn't say you had—" "Company," Abigail said, eyes sliding toward Clara. "Didn't know I needed to." Abigail gave a brittle laugh. "Well, I've come to collect what's mine. You always were one for long silences, but 3 years, that's a long time to let a claim go cold." Matthew didn't flinch. "Ain't yours?" She crossed her arms. "Pa left that land to both of us. You sold your share, took the money, and left. I changed my mind. That ain't how land works." Clara stood still, heart pounding. The children had come out of the barn and now watched from the doorway, sensing the shift in the air. "I could make trouble," Abigail said, eyes narrowing. "You already did." They stood like that, shadows growing long at their feet. Then Abigail turned, smoothing her dress. "I'll stay in town a few days. Think things over." She climbed back into the wagon without another word. As it pulled away, Matthew stood silent, shoulders square, jaw tight. Clara didn't speak. Neither did he. But something had changed. The quiet between them wasn't peace now, it was waiting. The edge of something coming. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Clara stepped outside. The moon lit the grass silver. Matthew stood near the fence, hands on the rails. "She wants the land?" Clara asked. He nodded. "She'll try to get it." "Can she?" "Not by law." "But law ain't everything out here." Clara crossed her arms against the wind. "Why now?" "Because she saw something worth taking." He didn't look at her when he said it, but she felt the words all the same. They stood in silence, side by side, not touching, not speaking, but steady. After a long while, Clara turned toward the barn. Before she reached the door, she stopped. "I won't let her take this," she said. "It wasn't a promise. It was a decision." The next morning, Clara rose before the sun. The baby stirred in her arms, rooting blindly before settling back to sleep. She tucked him close, kissed the crown of his head, and laid him gently in the straw. Then she stepped outside into the chill that still clung to the edge of dawn. The land stretched empty in every direction, dry grass glinting under the pale light the cabin outlined in stillness. Matthew was already out near the corral, checking the water trough. He didn't speak when he saw her, just nodded like he'd been expecting her. She walked up, slow, hands tucked in her skirt, eyes fixed on the dirt. "I want to know what she's after," Clara said. Matthew straightened, ran a hand across the back of his neck. "She thinks she's owed something. Always has. And she'll go through town to get it." He nodded once. "Her husband's a lawyer. Junior one, but still. She'll say I cheated her out of her inheritance." "Did you?" "No. But that don't matter much to people who want trouble more than truth." Clara looked out toward the fence line, the road beyond it. She felt the familiar press of survival rising again, sharp, dry, urgent. But it didn't scare her this time. Not like before. "Let me come with you." Matthew gave her a look uncertain. "To town. I want to see what we're up against. I've been turned away from enough doors. I'd like to look someone in the eye for once." He studied her a long moment, then nodded. "All right." By noon, Clara had scrubbed the children's faces clean, dressed the baby in a second-hand gown from a parcel Matthew had quietly left by the barn weeks earlier, and helped the girl tie her hair back with a ribbon made from an old flour sack. She wore the blue dress, the one with the tiny white flowers, and it fit her differently now. Not like borrowed cloth, but something worn and owned. The town hadn't changed. Same sagging facade, same cracked boardwalk. But Clara saw it with new eyes, not as a threat but as a place she might walk through without fear. The same faces turned toward her, curious, some disapproving. She met their stares without flinching. Inside the general store, Abigail stood near the counter, her hands resting lightly on a stack of letters. She turned at the sound of the door, and for a moment her eyes flicked over Clara's dress, the baby in her arms, the children flanking her side. Clara said nothing. She didn't need to. Matthew followed, setting down a folded piece of paper, a copy of the deed, his father's will, the terms of the land exchange from years ago. Abigail glanced at it, then turned her eyes back to Clara. "You've moved in, I see." Clara held her gaze. "I've earned my place." Abigail gave a small, tight smile. "He always did like strays." Clara stepped forward close enough to smell the perfume on Abigail's collar, sharp, manufactured, too clean for this place. "I've carried 3 children across 2 counties, buried a husband, gone cold and hungry more nights than you've seen in your life. I'm not a stray," she said softly. "I'm a woman who knows what she's worth." For a heartbeat no one spoke. Then Abigail looked at Matthew. "You'd let her speak for you." Matthew didn't blink. "She's not speaking for me. She's speaking the truth." Abigail's jaw set. "We'll see what the circuit judge thinks." Clara smiled, small and tired. "Yes," she said. "I suppose we will." They left the store without another word. Outside, the wind kicked dust across the road. The boy reached for Clara's hand. She took it. That night, Matthew built a fire behind the barn. They sat under the stars, the children asleep inside, the baby swaddled between them. "She'll come back," he said. "I know. She might win." "She won't," Clara said. Then, after a long pause, "And even if she does, I'll still be here." Matthew looked at her, long and quiet. She turned her face toward the flames, and in the reflection he saw it, the steel beneath her ribs, the warmth in her hands, the life she had built from nothing. He reached over slow and set his fingers lightly over hers. She didn't pull away. The hearing was set for mid-July, a date spoken aloud in town with just enough satisfaction by those who'd never cared much for the idea of a widow settling in a man's place. Heat had come early that month, heavy and unrelenting, baking the ground until it cracked, curling the leaves of the cottonwoods at their edges. The creek had shrunk down to a trickle, and every step across the yard kicked up dust that stuck to skin and sweat alike. Clara didn't complain. She rose earlier, worked harder, and never asked Matthew for reassurance, not even as the date drew near. But he noticed things. How her jaw stayed tight, even in her sleep. How she scrubbed the same shirt twice. How she began checking the barn door at night as though waiting for someone to come take it all back. He didn't offer false promises. He just stayed near, mended the hinges, fixed the porch step, rode to town twice for papers and updates. And every evening he made sure there was supper hot and ready, even when Clara insisted she could handle it. Then, 2 days before the hearing, a man rode out to the homestead, Abigail's husband. He wore a neat suit already dusted from the road, and his smile was polite in a way that felt like a blade behind the back. "I'd rather settle this before it goes to court," he said, dismounting, slow, like he expected Matthew to swing first. Clara stood beside the gate, the baby in her arms. Matthew didn't move. Not interested in selling. The man turned to Clara then. "You must be the woman everyone's talking about." She raised her chin. "If they're talking, I must be doing something right." He smiled wider. "I admire resilience. Truly. But this land wasn't meant to be yours." Clara's voice was flat. "It is now." He stepped closer. "There's no need to drag this into a fight. You've had a good run. No shame in starting over somewhere else. Abigail's willing to give you time to leave as a kindness." Clara's hands tightened on the baby's blanket. "This is my children's home. There's no kindness in asking them to lose it." Matthew stepped forward, then quiet but firm. "We're not leaving." The man studied them both, the way they stood together, not clinging, just solid. Then he shrugged like he hadn't expected more. "Well," he said, swinging back into the saddle, "judges tend to favor family. Don't be too disappointed when it turns." He rode off with dust in his wake. That night Clara didn't sleep. She sat by the stove watching the flames die low, the blue dress folded across her lap. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. Matthew brought her tea, left it by her elbow, and went back out to the yard. He walked the fence line, the same path his father had walked, boots pressing into dry earth. The wind rose around him, hot and strange, and for the first time in years he prayed not for justice or mercy, but for strength. Not for himself, but for her. The day of the hearing came dry and windless. Clara dressed the children in their cleanest clothes, buttoned every shirt, tied every shoe. Matthew stood in the doorway as she braided the girl's hair, his hat in his hands. They didn't speak of what might happen. They didn't need to. The courthouse was a room above the town's feed store, wood-paneled, hot windows stuck shut. The judge was a tired man with ink-stained cuffs and a squint that never seemed to clear. Abigail sat straight in her chair, lips pinched. Her husband did the talking, waving papers, citing old codes and words meant to intimidate. He talked about family, about duty, about rightful claims. Matthew said his piece without fanfare. He spoke slow, clear, told the truth. His voice didn't rise, didn't break. He named every fence post he'd dug, every winter storm he'd ridden through, every acre he'd worked since the day his father died. Then Clara stood. She wasn't called. She wasn't expected. But she stood. And in that hot, dust-filled room she told them what this place had meant to her. Not in law. In life. She didn't speak of tragedy. She didn't beg. She said what was true. That land isn't just what you hold, it's what you carry every day. That family isn't in blood, it's in choice. In who stays and who builds and who keeps going when no one else will. When she finished, the room was still. The judge cleared his throat, scribbled something, then said, "Claim upheld. No grounds for reversal." Abigail hissed. Her husband's face tightened. But it was done. Outside, the sun felt less cruel. The sky stretched wider. Matthew stepped down beside her, his hand brushing hers just once. They didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They went home. Together. The West still breathes. Subscribe and listen.